Hello and welcome to episode 9 of Middleware Friday for March 3rd, 2017. Today we're going to talk about Azure Logic Apps and connectivity with SAP. In addition to Logic Apps and SAP, we're also going to feature some community content. The first piece of content is from Michael Stevenson, and he talks about serverless versus codeless and has put together an interesting blog post, which I figured was worth highlighting. Next, we're going to highlight Steph Jan and a video blog that he's recently started where he's interviewed some integration pros, more specifically on a recent trip to Asia Pacific. So I figured I'd highlight that, give you a chance to meet some of the community members that live and work in that region. And lastly, we'll highlight some of the recent news coming out of the Logic Apps team and their Logic Apps live episode. So before we dive into the feature content, I figured it was worth putting together a few notes as we talk about SAP. So the SAP connector for Logic Apps is currently in preview, as is the on-premise data gateway that is used to bridge the cloud with your on-premise SAP system. As you know, Logic Apps is an integration platform as a service, and your SAP instance is traditionally or typically hosted within your data center, so you need to be able to bridge those two worlds, and you can go ahead and do that with the on-premise data gateway. Currently, there's no support for high availability scenarios, so that's something to be aware of as you're using this connector. The connector currently only supports send operations. Now these can be request and response, and in the flavors of RFCs, a remote function call, a TRFC, transaction remote functional call, a BAPI, which is an out-of-the-box module package that you can go ahead and call and execute, and lastly, intermediary document. Now, for those of you who may discover some gaps in this functionality, point you to the user voice where you can vote up or add any features that you feel are missing and give that feedback directly to the Logic Apps and connector team. I always like to provide an architecture slide just so people can visualize what this looks like. In this particular example, we've got a series of devices, doesn't really matter what they are, which are going to interact with Azure Logic Apps, and we're going to do that through an HTTP endpoint. And as part of that, we're then going to use the SAP connector to bridge our cloud environment with our on-premise data center. And really the magic under the hood with the on-premise data gateway is actually the Azure Service Bus Relay. So when you go ahead and provision the on-premise data gateway, you're actually also provisioning an Azure Service Relay endpoint. And that's how we're able to traverse firewalls. Now, once you have this on-premise data gateway installed, you have the ability to connect with your SAP systems. Now, for me, what I decided to do was to install this on-premise data gateway component on an existing BizTalk server, partly due to the prerequisite libraries that are required to talk to SAP. So those requirements haven't changed. You still need to get those DLLs. Those are typically found on the SAP Marketplace. Usually your basis admin can go ahead and pull that down. Now, if SAP is completely new to you, I will have a shameless plug for my book. And not to say that it's going to be like for like, but I do provide a lot of background on connecting to SAP, providing some terminology. And even though we're using a different connector, largely there's some shared semantics that are involved in connecting to SAP with Logic Apps, and you can still benefit from some of that information. So before we actually dive into the demo, I wanted to highlight or walk you through the process of getting the connector installed and provisioned. Now, as I mentioned, you already need to have the SAP libraries installed for the solution. And once you've got those DLLs in place, you can go ahead and install the on-premise data gateway. You can find the link to the on-premise data gateway at this particular location. And once you go ahead and download the gateway, you'll see you've got about a 30 meg install, and it's a fairly simple, straightforward process, which I'll walk you through. Pretty self-explanatory. Don't put the gateway on a machine that goes to sleep or shuts down via schedule because you'll lose your connectivity. Also, they're suggesting don't install it on a wireless network. Fair enough. Select the default installation location, and then you want to provide an email address to identify the account to use with this gateway. Now there is a bit of a caveat here, and we'll get to that in a few slides, but just ensure that this particular email address you have also has access within your Azure portal to be creating resources, because there's really a two-step process here where we have to install the data gateway on-prem, but then we actually need to configure the data gateway in the Azure portal. We can provide a data gateway name, which we'll want to be able to easily recognize when we're in Logic Apps and want to choose our connection. We also need to provide a recovery key, and we can use this in the event we ever need to recover our data gateway, perhaps move it to a different system or different environment. With that done, we now see that we've got a connected data gateway, and we're good to go. Also note that this is the same data gateway that you use for Power BI and for Power Apps and Microsoft Flow. So you don't have to create a lot of these data gateways all over the place. Obviously, if you've got a lot of throughput concerns, you may want to split those out as required, but don't feel the need, especially early on, that you need a data gateway per connection or per endpoint. Right, so we've gone through step 1, and now we're going to go ahead through step 2, and we're going to create the Azure on-premises data gateway resource. And we need to ensure, as I mentioned before, that we log into Azure using the same worker school email address that was used during the installation of the on-premise data gateway. So now I'm in the Azure portal. I can go ahead and do a search for on-premise data gateway. As noted, it is in preview. I can choose my subscription, the resource group, the location, and once I go ahead and provide this info, I should be able to find the installation name. So this was the installation name that I mentioned a couple slides ago. That should get populated in this dropdown. With that set up, I can go into SAP and I can go ahead and perform an action or choose an action. In this case, I'll type in SAP, and I have two options. I have an application server and I have a messaging server. Typically, and this isn't completely universal, but this is based upon my experience over the last 10 years with connecting to SAP, is application servers tend to be smaller instances of SAP. Sometimes those are your non-production environments. For example, say a dev or a project environment, whereas messaging servers tend to be more scaled out configurations. Typically, you'll see them in production. You may see them in a UAT environment or performance environment. Also note, as I mentioned before, we only have send action, so we can't put an SAP action as a trigger. In this particular example, we're going to go ahead and use application server since I'm connecting into a non-production instance. Now this will look pretty familiar if you've gone through the BizTalk configuration. These are just prerequisite details that you need to provide in order to connect to SAP. Client number, application server, host address, system number. If you have a gateway host or gateway server, you need to provide those. As you'll see, those are optional. In my case, it wasn't required. These are all details that you'll need to get from your Basis buddy. This part tends to be the most difficult part of connecting to SAP, is ensuring you have all of these details right and that the user account that you're going to connect with actually has the right permissions. Also note the authentication type in this case we're only left with basic. There's currently not Windows authentication at this time. With that configuration set, I should be able to connect. In my case, I was. And then I can go ahead and choose the type of service or interface that I want to go ahead and call. As I mentioned before, we've got BAPI, IDOC, RFC, TRFC. In my particular scenario, I went with RFC. And what that really is that's a remote function call. These tend to be custom. Like if you have a custom RFC, you would find it within RFC. Now also note, since this is preview, be aware that I ran into an issue where I couldn't actually go ahead and browse and find my RFC deep enough in the list. A normal or standard practice with SAP developers is anything that's custom starts with a Z or Z for my American friends. And when I went to scroll down, I couldn't actually reach the end of the list. But what you can do is you can actually type that name into the actual box, and that will still work for you if you're not able to browse. Also note that when you go ahead and send a message to SAP, we don't see kind of granular fields like we would if we were going to connect to, say, an API app endpoint with Swagger metadata, or say SharePoint Online. In the way this connector works is it's expecting a full message body, and then it'll actually process that whole message body and send it down to the connector and then SAP. For this particular episode, and this is why I have part 1 and part 2, we're just going to treat the message body as a whole. We're going to pass it right in to Azure Logic Apps, and then we're going to go ahead and execute that. Part 2, what I'm thinking is we're going to introduce schemas, maps, and the integration pack, which I haven't actually explored, so this gives me a great excuse to go ahead and go through that process, and we'll kind of move through more of an enterprise type scenario. Let's now jump into the live demo. Here we are now in the Azure portal, and I will show you a Logic app that connects to SAP. Now this is probably the simplest interface you'll ever see that allows you to integrate with SAP, but here we go. We've got an HTTP request inbound. Note, I have not provided an inbound JSON schema. In this case, we're dealing with XML. I'm not trying to apply any sort of schema against the inbound message. And I'll show you what that looks like shortly when we actually go and run the demo. Next, I'm going to provide my SAP action. Now, if this namespace looks familiar, it's because it's the same one that is used inside of the BizTalk adapter and the BizTalk messages. So what I've actually done here is I've taken an existing RFC that BizTalk uses to connect to SAP with. I've taken some sample message bodies out of BizTalk, and I'm actually using those messages in this particular scenario. Now notice I don't have any sort of maps in place. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to focus on part 2 of that solution where we actually do some level of transformation before we actually talk to SAP. So here we're providing an SAP action, and then we're going to provide a body, which is really the body that was passed as part of this HTTP post request to the Logic app. Lastly, from a response perspective, we're just going to provide a status code of 200, and we're going to provide the SAP response from the SAP connector. In this case, the RFC itself is going to retrieve an equipment list from a plant, a power plant. So you can think of a power plant would have many pieces of equipment, and if you wanted to use that equipment, say number or description in some other applications, you would want to reference this master data inside of SAP. We're now in Postman, and we're going to use this as the tool that's going to submit the message to Logic Apps, which in turn will forward it off to SAP. Now, as I mentioned before, here's our XML message that we're going to submit. This was a message body that was retrieved from BizTalk server, and we can go ahead and pass this same message into the Logic app. I'm going to go ahead and click send here. And what we'll find is we have a response coming back from SAP. I'm not going to scroll through all of the data just because I don't want to expose any potential sensitive company data, but you get the idea of how this actually works. We get an XML response with the typical SAP return types and all of the metadata associated with the transaction. Moving on to our community content portion of the show, I want to chat about a recent blog post from fellow MVP Michael Stevenson. Now, if you follow Michael, you'll know that he has a lot of interesting architecture-related posts, and this one caught my eye in part due to kind of the buzzword of serverless that's going around right now. Now, serverless really I guess, became mainstream popular through Amazon and some of their work with their Lambdas. And more recently in the Microsoft ecosystem, we're seeing that term more so with Azure Functions. But if you think about it, serverless also applies to logic apps. Now, there's some noise in the industry, well, how serverless is a dumb name, just because ultimately everything is going to run on a server. But the idea is really that it's abstracted away from us. Like when we go into a logic app, we have no idea what is the underlying host that is supporting it. Much like if we go into Azure Functions, we have no idea what the underlying server is. As opposed to, say, Azure SQL Database, where we can use that in a platform as a service manner, but we do have a server name that is exposed to us, and we're able to see where that's living. Now, really, the benefit of serverless is the idea of scale, where the platform itself or the fabric is going to scale based upon demand. And as developers or architects, we don't actually need to be concerned with that scale. That really becomes the problem of the cloud provider, in this case Microsoft, who is going to have enough capacity to provision on demand the resources that we require in order to support our application. So let's just take a quick look at Michael's post. Now he's done a little bit of the Magic Quadrant-esque type illustration, and really what he's talking about is areas or services where you require zero code, lots of code, and just different access in terms of server full or serverless. So if we talk about BizTalk Server, IaaS, Windows Services, SSIS, those are definitely server full type applications, typically with a lot of code. You're responsible for rolling your code. We get into some of the serverless solutions, and we'll find things like web apps, web jobs, API apps, where you're still writing a lot of code typically, but you're not as concerned with the underlying server that's supporting your workload. Similarly, we've got Azure Automation, Azure Functions, Data Factory, Logic Apps, API Management, Flow, Power Apps. So this is where we start to get into some of the citizen type developer services. And then we also have an arrow where these are really building blocks or platforms, like for example, Service Bus. We're not actually writing any code. We may write code in order to interact with Service Bus queues and topics and event hubs. We don't necessarily have to. We can use a connector or an adapter. But those are really just services that we can actually go ahead and use. So I like this part that Mike has provided here. How can I use this information? So he's given a few scenarios that you can explore. And I think what's really important here is to understand the nature of your organization. Some organizations are really adverse to writing a lot of code. Other organizations embrace it. So now as an architect, when you're trying to determine the right solution, this may help guide you towards what solution you want to use based upon your appetite to write more code or less code. So it's a good article. I encourage you to check it out. Next up, we want to take a look at Steph Jan's video blog, where he has interviewed a bunch of integration pros in Australia and New Zealand on some of his recent travels. So feel free to get a chance to listen to some of our community peers who are well known and doing some great work in that region of the world. Also get some insight into what these folks have planned for the upcoming Global Integration Bootcamp. Next up in our community content is some of the updates provided by the Logic Apps team and Logic Apps Live. These guys always do a great job of hosting a monthly show. It's not only educational, but it's entertaining. In this case, they had some troubles with the Australia heat and laptops overheating, but they were able to pull it off. And they also had a really interesting interview with a partner in the Australian ecosystem who's actually got some real world Logic App experience and shared some of the things they've done in order to productionalize their Logic Apps. So in terms of what's new, there's header name value control. There's some updates to the portal management blade, which was really interesting, so that's worth checking out. Relative URL with custom methods. So this is something I'm going to explore in a future episode. As you noticed earlier, we did a post, and in that case, I guess it made sense because SAP was expecting a message body. But I have been in a situation before where I've had to artificially create a post when a GET would have been more appropriate. So this is pretty cool. Now with your HTTP endpoints, you can provide different HTTP verbs, but then also provide a different URL. As you may have noticed before, a lot of them are called manual run, which you can abstract if you're using API management, but otherwise you have this name that may not be all that intuitive. Another feature which I absolutely love is the ability to generate JSON schema from sample payload. So I've been using this recently. You could use JSON-schema.net, but in this case, nice if I don't have to leave the tool itself. Same thing if you want to make a quick edit to an Azure function, you can do that from the Logic App without having to leave. Here's some additional connectors, some of them SaaS. Also, we've got SQL on-prem stored procs. So these are worth checking out. The one that's of particular, well, I guess there's a couple that are of particular interest to me. Azure Automation, which gets interesting if you need to do some level of automated provisioning. What is kind of interesting is you could actually put a front end on top of this, perhaps a Power App, that would allow some of your, say, administrators or developers to turn Azure VMs on or off, and that Power App could interface with Azure Logic Apps and do some of that heavy lifting through the Azure Automation APIs. Also, Lewis, the language understanding API, that's a particular interest to me. I've been spending more time with bots. I recently presented at a local Microsoft oil and gas event where I talked a little bit about Lewis and the bot framework. How this can work with Logic Apps is of interest to me, and I'll have to find a scenario that makes sense to go ahead and demo it for Middleware Friday. Also, in progress, variables are still in progress. Exposing retries, that'll be nice. Currently, you're editing the underlying JSON. Converting array as a table or CSV action, that'll be cool. I've had to write Azure function code in the past in order to do that. Selecting a service bus namespace picker, that's pretty cool. Today you might be in the middle of your Logic App. You want to connect to service bus. You either create a new tab or you hit the back button. Either way, you've got a little bit of friction in terms of getting your service bus connectivity details. But now if I can actually just select that from within my subscription, that's pretty awesome. New region, Canada. Anxiously awaiting that to be rolled out, and we'll have to provision a Logic App in Canada just to celebrate. Also some updates related to connectors. We've got some of the kind of traditional BizTalk line of business pack connectors like Oracle DB, Oracle EBS. So those will be welcomed for some folks, I'm sure. SQL Trigger, yeah, that sounds good. Blob Trigger, Zendesk, and you can see some of the additional SaaS connectors that we will soon see light up inside of Azure. Also, another reminder about the Global Integration Bootcamp. I know that there's been another location added in the United States. In this case, it's in the greater Seattle, or actually Redmond area. Tom Cantor is the person leading that. So if you are near the Pac Northwest, I encourage you to check it out. Also, I do know some of the locations are starting to fill up. I know some have tried to expand it and find additional venues, but the nature of running labs will naturally create some challenges for having a very large venue. So if you're interested in attending the Global Integration Bootcamp, it's on March 25th. So I encourage you to sign up for that sooner than later in order to avoid disappointment. Feedback, keep it coming. I'm continuing to monitor both this Twitter account and this email account. Let me know what you want to see. Let me know what you liked, what you didn't like. Also want to thank BizTalk360 for being a partner of the show. Last week in episode 8, we talked about monitoring Service Bus queues and topics using Service Bus 360. So feel free to check out that episode if you haven't seen it already. It may provide you with a good monitoring solution for your Service Bus queues and topics. Lastly, I'll leave you with the music credits for this week. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week on Middleware Friday.
I feel that you're someone that's not only concerned with what's happening right now, but with your legacy as well. What is the legacy that you're looking to leave behind?
That I changed the world and I have fun doing it.
Rolling 'cause we all got dreams. I keep 'em rolling 'cause we all got dreams. Hey, I keep it rolling 'cause we all got dreams. I keep it rolling 'cause we all got dreams. Right? I keep it rolling 'cause we all got dreams. I keep it rolling 'cause we all got dreams. Yeah, I keep it rolling 'cause we all got dreams. I keep it rolling 'cause we all got. Yeah, the way I see it, it's only me and my team. Motivated by pictures of places I've never been. Itching to leave the city in search of some better things. My fam and a couple dollars, that's all that's left in my jeans. Ain't accepted by nothing, we gunning by any means. Wide awake on the surface, inside I'm living this dream of going city to city with stories of what I seen. Lost in the translation, the mind of a human being. I'm riding on life's pavement and trying to find what it means. Fighting for something stronger than bottles of Jimmy Bean. Study the moves of legends from Bob Marley to Queens, but drawing my inspiration from Rage Against the Machine. Saw it as a motivation and fueling my self-esteem. Could have been stationary, instead on stations I scheme. Throw myself on the road to becoming something obscene. It's just the sound of a gentleman getting after his dreams. Run it.